Hi, I'm Mel Moore, and I'm one of the pastors here at Peaceful Christian Fellowship. And we've been doing a preaching series through the book of James. So I'm picking up in chapter 4, verses 11 and 12. And I'm going to just go ahead and read that passage and then dive right in. So starting in verse 11, do not speak evil against one another, brothers and sisters. Whoever speaks evil against another or judges another speaks evil against the law and judges the law. But if you judge the law, you are not a doer of the law, but a judge. There is one lawgiver and judge who is able to save and to destroy. So who then are you to judge your neighbor? I gotta tell you the truth here. I did not want to preach this sermon. I did not like this passage when I first came across it because it says things I don't really want to hear. Since the day I was born, I have been a very justice-minded person. My natural instinct is to fight for the underdog. But I also tend to see things in very black and white terms, and I tend to see people in very good or evil terms. When I see what I understand to be an injustice done, I want to raise hell. I want to burn the system down. In my zeal for what I understand to be right, I often end up reducing the person I understand to be wrong down to their most recent behavior. Or, more often than I'd like to admit, down to what I think they've done. I wish I could say that I'm only talking about political figures or powerful strangers who abuse their powers, doing great harm to people in this world through their actions. But with a lifetime of practice under my belt, the people closest to me can become my enemies in an instant because they've stepped on my toes in some way that they don't even know about half the time. And I don't think I'm alone in this. So when I first came across this passage, I didn't like it because I saw myself in it. I saw James talking to me. I'm not going to spend time on the original context of this passage because what we need to hear today is how this matters to us today. In writing these words, James is calling us to a more holistic understanding of righteousness and justice. He is calling us to remember that we are children of the God of love, even when we must shine a light on evil done to us or to someone else. James tells us that we're not to speak evil against each other. Specifically, he mentions our brothers and sisters, here understood as fellow Christians, but he also mentions our neighbors. Now, the world James wrote in was much smaller than the world we live in today. The Christians he wrote to did not live in a 24/7 global news cycle. They didn't experience their brother and sister, their neighbor, through a two-dimensional social media interface that reduces the other person to bite-sized, oversimplified, deconstructed versions of who they really are. But this is the reality we live in, and the information comes at us fast and furious, stripping us of context and compassion, turning our brothers and our sisters and our neighbors into digital enemies at the other end of our keyboards. What I mean to say is, it is very easy, particularly right now in the United States, to turn brothers, sisters, and neighbors into enemies, whether we do this face-to-face or digitally. It's very easy for us to judge each other rather than seek to understand each other. It's very easy for us to cut off all roads of communication and write our brother and our sister and our neighbor off as hopeless. But James calls us to something better. He calls us to make peace rather than speak evil. For us to practice this, we have to understand what he does and doesn't mean here. So first, let's define what James means when he says that we're not to speak evil against one another. For a variety of reasons, passages like this have historically been used to shut down any negative feedback. Often, people in power want to keep power, and many of us are not comfortable with conflict or confrontation. So a passage like this can feel really appealing to someone with those propensities. It seems to say that we're not allowed to say anything bad ever. I know, though, that this can't be true, and not just because I don't want it to be true. If we go back even half a paragraph in this passage, we see that James himself says very hard things to his audience. He calls them adulterers, sinners, double-minded. He tells them to purify their hearts, to wash their hands, to lament and mourn and weep and humble themselves before God. These are not easy words to receive. They're not nice words. But what sets them apart from speaking evil about each other is that these words were rooted in love. These words were spoken by James with the goal of challenging people he loves to grow in their understanding of themselves and of God, and from that growth become people who help grow the world around them. Now we know that we know from this that there's not just a way to speak up for what's right when wrong has been done, to call each other to do better and to be better, but that there's also precedent to do it. For some of us, that is the challenge. That's the thing that we're uncomfortable doing. Some of us are incredibly uncomfortable when speaking up when we see wrong done. James sets the example here, though, and shows us that actions that harm another person need to be confronted. For me, though, that's just not the challenge. For me, the challenge is learning to confront wrongs done without writing off the other person. And this passage exists for people like me. People who, in our zeal to seek justice and speak truth, become so focused on the very real hurt and harm that has been done that we forget the harm we do when we cut off any hope of growth and peace with our words. Before I talk about what it means to speak evil about a brother or sister or neighbor, I want to make one more clarification on what it does not mean. It does not mean that we shield our brother or sister or neighbor from the consequences of their actions. We live in a country with a justice system. We follow a God who hates evil. So when a person brings toxicity into their relationships, we cannot, as followers of Christ, allow that to continue unchecked. But there's a difference between not allowing evil to be perpetuated and cutting a person off from the opportunity to grow. So, what happens when we speak evil about a brother or sister or neighbor? What does it mean to do this? It means that by our words and our actions, we have reduced that other person to our understanding of their most recent troubling behavior. We have witnessed or perceived violence or wrong, sometimes even an inconvenience. And we set ourselves in opposition to that person because of this behavior and this behavior alone. We move from saying, brother, sister, what you're doing is harmful. And we move from that to, get away from me, you heretic, you're unredeemable. There's nothing of value within you. We set ourselves up as better than this other person, as though we are not ourselves a mixed bag of failures and sin and glory and beauty. We strip this other person of their God-given identity, that identity being that they are beloved by God, so beloved that Christ died for them. We raise ourselves above them falsely, believing that we are more worthy of God's affection than they are, that we are closer to God than they are, that we have not received grace as they have, but that we have received what we deserve from God because we're better. Perhaps you see where James is going with this, because James knows where this leads. When we write off another person, we truly become false judges. We judge based only on what we think we know, but we don't hold in our hands and in our minds the entire context of this person's life. We don't hold the keys to understanding the complexities of that person, and yet we speak and behave as though we understand everything. James says that when we reduce another person to their darkest offenses, we usurp God's role. We shove God aside and we say that we know better than he does, that we know whether or not this person is worthy, that we know what should happen to this person. Ultimately, we forget the gospel. And in forgetting the gospel, we wind up condemning ourselves along with our enemy, because without the gospel, we're all in trouble. God desires relationship with us, not because we merit it, not because we've said the right things or done the right things or kept ourselves clean. He desires relationship with us because he made us and he loves us and we are his. He desires relationship with us despite the ways that we have failed to reflect his love to ourselves and to our friends and neighbors and to the world. The gospel's not about worthiness. If it was, none of us would survive. The gospel is about grace and love, a love that makes us whole. So what then? What do we do with this information when we find ourselves in conflict with our brothers and sisters, with our neighbors, and honestly with the power structures alive and at work in the world today? Well, we need to pause before we run into combat. When we speak evil, we shut off growth. We shut off growth within ourselves because we falsely elevate ourselves as people who escape judgment. We position ourselves above the law rather than as people who are beholden to God's law of love. And we shut off growth within the other person because we condemn that person and we throw them out of our camp. So the opposite of don't speak evil is not don't speak. It is speak the truth in love. And speaking the truth in love requires us to contextualize. It requires us to contextualize ourselves, the person who we are at odds with, and God. James says there is one judge who is able to save or condemn. We are so much less powerful than we might think that we are. We don't actually have the power to condemn or destroy another person. We don't have the power to save another person. Only God does. In light of this, we must pause before we confront. And in our pausing, we must ask a series of questions that will ground us in a deeper, truer, richer understanding of ourselves, of the person we're at odds with, and of God. So first, we need to contextualize ourselves. We need to ask ourselves, remind ourselves, where have I needed God's grace in my life? Where have I needed forgiveness from other people? Where have I failed or misstepped or even harmed another person? Because the reality is I have. We all have. And the truth is that I need grace, and that easily slips from my mind the second that I find myself at odds with another person. Next, we need to put our brother, our sister, our neighbor into context. I may know this one thing about the other person. I know that they have said or done something that hurts me or hurts someone I care about. But what I don't know is vast. So I have to ask, what don't I know about this person? What am I missing? What might this person be struggling with in their own life? Are they missing information when they speak? And more importantly, where has this person shined before? Where has this person shown themselves to be a faithful friend or neighbor? Where have I seen God at work in this other person? And this, of course, is one of the biggest problems of social media, because we often end up interacting with people completely stripped of their context. Finally, what do I know about God? I know that God is not building his kingdom of peace by kicking out all of the evil people, because if he were building his kingdom that way, there would be no kingdom. There would be no people. Instead, God builds his kingdom of peace by rooting us in relationship with him. He is the only one capable of bringing us into the fullest measure of who he has made us to be. He is the only one who is capable of forgiving us completely when we do sin. And he is the only one who is capable of gathering a diverse group of people who in any other context would be at odds with each other and building a beautiful living community through them. When we take 5 minutes before we go on our attacks to pause and to ask these questions, our would-be attacks become opportunities for growth, for understanding and reconciliation, for redemption and change. By restoring our own humanity and restoring the humanity of the person who in that moment feels like our enemy, we return God to where he belongs. We allow God to make miracles in the midst of disagreement and hurt and real pain. Challenges like this come alive when we have concrete examples that we can hitch our imaginations to. So I've been thinking about this. I've been thinking through it regarding my own life, and I have come to the painful reality that I struggle to practice this. I don't have many examples in which I have felt attacked or harmed by someone else and took the 5 minutes necessary to recontextualize the situation and restore their humanity before I attacked them back. In fact, just yesterday morning, I came about this exact situation from the wrong direction. Justin and I were on a walk and we were talking about heavy topics, and I got scared and I went global with my fears, and we ended up in an argument. And before I knew what I was doing, I had pitted myself against my husband as though he was my enemy. I didn't take 5 minutes to remember that both of us, just like every other person probably in the world and certainly in the United States right now, are under significant amounts of stress. I didn't take 5 minutes to remember that neither of us planned to have this conversation, and both of us were taken off guard by it. I didn't take 5 minutes to remember that my husband is very much for me and wants me to thrive and succeed and grow. So I got really defensive really fast. But the good news is Justin didn't give up on me. He sat down and patiently recontextualized this entire situation with me. He practiced the spiritual art of humanizing both of us. He practiced the spiritual art of reminding me and himself who God is and what God is capable of. So the good news is, even though I am terrible at this practice, I have people in my life who help me practice it. And I wager that that is true for each one of us. Wherever we might be in this spiritual practice, what I can tell you, what I can promise you, is that God is not like me. God is infinitely patient with us. God is not surprised or thrown off guard when we struggle. God does not give up on us when we fail or when we do or say something harmful or even dangerous. God has invested in us because he loves us. And because he loves us and is invested in us, we know where we're heading. We know that the peace that we practice now will someday flourish completely, and that there will be no more need to navigate conflict. Until that day, though, James acts as a guide for us on how we might do conflict well. Before I wrap up, I have a favor to ask of you. When I was researching this sermon, I came across another sermon by Oshita Moore. I'm going to provide a link to her sermon along with start and stop times to listen to it, because it's part of a podcast that includes an introduction to the sermon and some discussion after the sermon. So if you just want to listen to the sermon, pay attention to those stops and start times. But in considering what I was going to say today, I leaned heavily on this sermon, but I cannot do it justice. So please, the second that you stop listening to my sermon, follow the link and go listen to this woman's sermon. You will be missing out if you do not. She's dedicated her life to peacemaking, and she provides beautiful, brilliant, and practical tools for practicing the contextualization that I'm talking about. Now, I'm going to close with a blessing. And this blessing is by Jan Richardson and is called The Grace That Scorches Us. The grace that scorches us. Here's one thing you must understand about this blessing. It is not for you alone. It is stubborn about this. Do not even try to lay hold of it if you are by yourself, thinking you can carry it on your own. To bear this blessing, you must first take yourself to the place where everyone does not look like you or think like you, a place where they do not believe precisely as you believe, where their thoughts and ideas and gestures are not exact echoes of your own. Bring your sorrow, bring your grief, bring your fear, Bring your weariness, your pain, your disgust at how broken the world is, how fractured, how fragmented by its fighting, its wars, its hungers, its penchant for power, its ceaseless repetition of the history it refuses to rise above. I will not tell you this blessing will fix all that. But in the place where you have gathered, wait, watch, listen, lay aside your inability to be surprised, your resistance to what you do not understand. See then whether this blessing turns to flame on your tongue, sets you to speaking what you cannot fathom, or opens your ear to a language beyond your imagining that comes as a knowing in your bones, a clarity in your heart that tells you this is the reason we were made, for this ache that finally opens us, for this struggle, this grace that scorches us toward one another and into the blazing day. Amen.